Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 on Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Ruth Watson. I'm pleased to welcome tonight's guest to the show, SNP MP for East Renfrewshire, Kirsten Oswald, Deputy Leader at Westminster as well. Thank you for joining us this evening, Kirsten.
Hi, Ruth.
So I'll go through today's headlines and then we'll get back to the meat of the programme and have a chat with Kirsten and see what she thinks about today's stories. The Ukraine update, the Russian war in Ukraine, day 217. Ukraine's foreign ministry has said the propaganda show called referendums in the temporary occupied territories are yet another crime and that it renders them null and worthless. President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine will defend its citizens in Moscow-held regions that authorities had claimed voted in favour of merging with Russia. The Bank of England has taken emergency action to calm turmoil in financial markets amid the collapse in the pound and the increase in government borrowing costs triggered by Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget. Food prices in the UK have soared to a record 10.6% this month as the war in Ukraine and Brexit continues to drive the cost of staples such as margarine, pasta, and tinned tomatoes to new highs. More than 1 million people in the UK have experienced life-threatening asthma attacks after cutting back on medicine, heating, or food amid the soaring cost of living crisis, a survey suggests. A Scottish Parliament report has recommended that the UK government take action to align benefits and tax credits with inflation and to reinstate the uplift in universal credit to tackle Scotland's health inequalities. More than $8 billion has been pledged by private corporations and non-profit groups to help President Biden achieve his goal to end hunger and cut diet-related diseases, White House officials announced today. Residents in Florida are bracing themselves for the landfall of a storm that had strengthened overnight into a Category 4 hurricane and left Cuba without power after the entire country's electricity grid collapsed in its wake. A new website providing information on the wide range of advice and financial support available to people in Scotland has been launched by the Scottish Government. A Scottish charity that is working in Ukraine to remove debris left behind by the ongoing invasion by Russia has received £300,000 of Scottish Government funding. Health Secretary Humza Yousaf visited a GP practice during Climate Week to learn about work to support patients to switch to more environmentally friendly asthma inhalers. Well, to go back to the Ukraine update, the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, told Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky in a call on Wednesday that Germany would never accept the results of the sham referendums on joining Russia in occupied regions of Ukraine. Israel has said that it will not accept the results of the referendum in the eastern districts of Ukraine. As expected, official figures given by Russian proxy authorities in occupied Ukraine for the outcome of the votes show support for annexation. The Moscow-installed leader of the occupied part of Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia region, Yevgeny Belitsky, has appealed to Putin to incorporate the region into Russia. It is anticipated that the next planned session of Russia's Federation Council will take place on the 4th of October and could see legislative moves from Moscow to absorb the 4 areas of Ukraine that its forces partially occupy. Joseph Borrell, the EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, has condemned both the illegal referenda and their falsified outcome, and the suspected sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. European leaders have said sabotage is the most likely cause of leaks in the 2 Nord Stream gas pipelines between Russia and Europe after seismologists reported explosions around the Baltic Sea lines. Norway's Foreign Minister, Anniken Huitfeldt, has said the explosions and gas leakage into the Baltic Sea are a matter of deep concern to the Norwegian government. Denmark's Defence Minister, Morten Bodskov, has said there is reason to be concerned about the security situation in the Baltic Sea region. The US Embassy in Moscow has issued a security alert and urged American citizens to leave Russia immediately. The US said overnight it will introduce a resolution at the UN Security Council calling on member states not to recognize any change to Ukraine and obliging Russia to withdraw its troops, US Ambassador Linda Thomas Greenfield said. Poland's foreign minister, Zbigniew Rau, has said NATO's response to any use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine should be non-nuclear but devastating. Well, devastating is a word, Kirsten. It's extremely alarming to see the way in which the Russian occupation of Ukraine is continuing apace. What's the view within Westminster or the politicians that you're dealing with about what's happening in Ukraine and the options perhaps facing Putin as he increasingly comes under pressure?
You know, he certainly is under a lot of pressure. I think that, you know, we can see that between his, you know, various strands of saber rattling, between the, you know, these false referenda that, you know, he's now looking to rely upon, which, you know, as I think we heard from you just now, other countries can see for what they are. You know, it's just another leaf in the book that Putin is writing about, you know, how to you know, override democracy and override the wishes of the people in Ukraine. I think that it's one of these possibly quite rare situations at Westminster where there is a really strong degree of agreement across the parties that sit in that parliament about the situation in Ukraine, about the way that Putin needs to be dealt with, about the challenges that are faced by the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people, you know, who are on the ground and continue to suffer under the you know, the really challenging situations that Putin is causing them to have to deal with. So, you know, I think that that's probably a really positive thing in terms of how we take things forward. I think that, you know, a measured approach towards Putin's very unmeasured behaviour and unmeasured words is probably the right thing to do, and I think that you know, that certainly continues to be the direction of travel. But he's obviously deeply worried and deeply concerned that things are not going the way that he wants them to, and you know, they've not been going the way that he would have anticipated for a while. And I think that, you know, this latest saber rattling is all about that. I think that that's why we're seeing all of this sham referenda nonsense, and you know, it is and it remains deeply concerning.
What do you make of the foreign analysts who say that there is the potential for Russia to fall apart, the Russian Federation to fall apart, um, if perhaps the inhabitants of those areas that previously just maybe went along with Putin's very heavy-handed and, you know, sort of increasingly undemocratic way of dealing with democracy. You know, when we see the protests in, for example, Dagestan and other areas, as people face their young men and older men being taken away to fight in a war that some people now are calling Russia's Vietnam. Is there any sense in any of the briefings that you get that perhaps that Putin may have wider worries at home to contend with?
I mean, I'm sure he does have worries at home that he hasn't previously had, and that he wouldn't have expected to be facing. And you know, the way that he's dealing with these worries is to both crack down on the people who live in Russia, who are, you know, just like everybody else, trying to get on with their daily lives. You know, the Russian people have not asked for this extraordinary situation, and you know, they are now finding that, you know, there's conscription being imposed upon them. They continue to be fed all kinds of fake narratives about what's actually going on. So it's very difficult, I think, for the reality of the situation to be clear to people in an awful lot of Russia. But nonetheless, despite all of the efforts that Putin and his cronies are making to keep the reality away from the people on the ground in Russia, obviously people are able to get some of that information, and I think that that is probably what lies behind some of the protests we've seen, as well as obviously people's reluctance to be conscripted to fight in a situation where, you know, they wouldn't have expected to be fighting, and they may have deep concerns about both their own well-being and also the reason that they're being conscripted into fight. So, I think he does face a number of challenges on the home front, as well as being in an incredibly difficult position in terms of the international space that he sits in, because he is obviously quite isolated. I think that, nonetheless, he has a particular course of action that he wishes to pursue, and I think that the thing that we need to do is to be supportive of Ukraine, and to try and make sure that we are able to give them what we can by way of sort of practical assistance.
Well, it's good to see that the Westminster parties and politicians are so united on that front. An area where there is perhaps significantly less unification of opinion is Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget. The Bank of England has taken emergency action to calm turmoil in financial markets amid the collapse in the pound and the increase in government borrowing costs triggered by Kwasi Kwarteng's mini budget. The Bank of England said it was taking urgent steps to buy UK government bonds, beginning immediately in an attempt to stabilise the market. Taking evasive action less than a week after the Chancellor announced 45 billion in unfunded tax cuts, the Bank of England said it would undertake temporary and targeted purchases in the gilt market on financial stability grounds. Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng are under increasing pressure from their own party to U-turn on their tax cutting plans. Tory MPs expressed disbelief at how the government's announcement had sunk sterling and caused market turbulence during the cost of living crisis and worst economic backdrop in a generation, or several generations. Hugh Merriman, the chair of Transport Select Committee, said polls suggested Truss was losing Tory votes by introducing exactly the policies that her leadership rival Rishi Sunak had warned about. The SNP has called for the Chancellor to recall Parliament and bring forward an emergency statement to reverse the damage caused by the Tory budget, as concerns grow that the UK could be heading for a crash of historic proportions. Following the intervention from the International Monetary Fund and US Treasury, Ian Blackford MP said the Chancellor must act now to reverse the damage he has caused and avoid an unprecedented economic crash, warning that rising inflation, interest rates, and bond yields, coupled with the falling pound and the withdrawal of competitive mortgage deals, could lead to a UK economic catastrophe. Well, not just UK, Kirsten. I mean, I've been hearing several international players in the money markets um, saying that perhaps the UK not only is sort of emerging, its economy is behaving as an emerging economy might behave, but it may also trigger yet another global economic crisis, especially if the markets start just collapsing around us. What's your take on this, and how likely is it that Liz Truss is going to come out from her particular brand of fridge?
Do you know, I mean, actually, that's, I think, one of the most extraordinary in a whole series of extraordinary, um, elements of this situation that we're seeing, is that the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, for that matter, are completely missing in action. Where on earth are they? How can it possibly be the case that in the face of this, I think, really unprecedented economic chaos, which has been caused by their actions, they've just vanished. They've just disappeared. They're hiding somewhere, and that, I think, is really a shameful way to behave. People are deeply concerned. They're, worried about how they're going to manage. They're worried about their bills. All of this chaos is having a significantly challenging effect on, things like mortgages and, everything. I think surrounding the cost of living is obviously amplified by this extraordinary situation. So, where are the people who have caused this to happen? Where are these people who are meant to be in charge of the UK government? They've just vanished. And that is one of the reasons that we really need Parliament to be recalled, because the Westminster Parliament has been in a bit of a limbo over the cost of living over recent months, because the Tory leadership contest has caused the UK government to spend its entire time looking in on itself. And absolutely neglecting to do what really was needed in terms of trying to support people through what was already a very difficult time. So that they're not there, they've not been there, they're still not there. We really need to be sitting, and we need to be sitting now so that we can scrutinise, so that we can challenge, and so that they can take action to try and remedy some of this chaos that they've caused. But as far as I can see at the moment, they have absolutely no intention to do that. And instead, we're left looking askance, as are people across the world, at this terrible situation which doesn't appear to have an end point.
So, what do you think is the answer? I mean, what if if you were able to have a word in Kwasi Kwarteng's ear, or if this trust would even think about listening to anybody, what what would you be saying? What would you say is the way ahead?
I think that that whole notion of people having a word in the ear of the Chancellor or the Prime Minister is really timely and important, because one of the issues which has, I think, led us to this extreme situation is that they're not listening. They haven't been listening. They haven't been listening to the people who should be advising in these kind of situations. They've decided on a path, and they've decided that they're going to plough ahead regardless of what experts would have told them had they chosen to consult with them. And I think that they've chosen to do exactly the opposite of that. So, what should happen, as I've said, is that there should be a recall. Now, that's something that is in the gift of the UK government. And that's a great pity that that's the system, because I don't think there's any doubt that the SNP and all the other opposition parties as well would absolutely want a recall. But we can't do that. That is not something that anyone other than the UK government, with the agreement of the Speaker, can do. So without that, then, everything is completely up in the air. We don't have the opportunity to look for them to reverse the decisions that have been made. And, I think that's really the crucial thing. We need to find a way of rowing back. And, that really matters, because it is having a significant impact on people's day-to-day lives. And any remedial steps that are being taken, in terms of the action today, where the Bank of England have had to step in, and the Treasury subsequently, mean that people will be facing a situation where we're essentially paying to try and deal with this chaos that has been caused. So, really someone needs to take the tiller, someone needs to take control. But for that to happen, we absolutely can't wait for Kwasi Kwarteng's statement, which he's telling us he's going to make in 8 weeks' time. We're really in a situation where we're talking in hours. Not even days necessarily. We cannot possibly wait for 8 weeks. It's absolutely beyond belief that that is a suggestion that continues to be made, that we can hold on in that way.
What do you make of those commentators, and they are increasing, that say that the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg, his father wrote a book about how to get rich on disaster capitalism, and there's the trail of those people who worked for Crispin Odey, the hedge fund manager. Kwasi Kwarteng himself worked for it. I understand that Jacob Rees-Mogg has an annual donation from Crispin Odey. I know that it is said that after Brexit, for example, Nigel Farage made a significant amount of money, or was alleged to have made a significant amount of money when the pound took its slump after Brexit, and Kwasi Kwarteng was quoted by a journalist yesterday as being quite sort of jubilant about the markets after Brexit, because he said, oh, it's okay, it'll bounce back, everything's going to be fine. Do you think that there is any chance that there will be an investigation of any sort into perhaps any potential, or those allegations of some people that perhaps there's an element of impropriety, or if not as far as impropriety, too cozy an arrangement with some of these neoliberalist think tanks that seem to have funding from sort of shady sources, or obscured sources, and the likes of people who play the money markets?
I think that, probably there are a range of questions that people will want to ask about how has this come to pass? Why on earth are we in this extraordinary situation? And whose ideas are these that are being um, put into play in a way that has such a challenging impact on people's day to day lives? And as I've said, whilst we have apparently nobody in charge because nobody's willing to come out and talk. So yeah, where are these ideas coming from? Where are the advisors? What happened in the new Truss government with advisors apparently leaving the building, and who's come in the place of these advisors? Where did this all start? The Saudi saga since Brexit, as you said, has been one of a sort of ever decreasing circle of the poor economic decisions and significant challenges that then occur for individuals across Scotland and further afield across the UK as well. So it is reasonable, I think, for us to ask what kind of ethos, what kind of advice, what kind of conversations are happening in that regard. I think that first, however, we probably need to deal with the here and now, because people are going to be in a position where we're all paying for this for a long time. People are deeply worried about how they're going to manage, and I think that we need remedial action on that, and we need that fast.
I mean, this added to the cost of living crisis, which was already, like the train heading down the track towards, if you sort of think of the people of Scotland and the people of the UK as being tied to the train tracks, and sort of the Tory train is heading towards us. I mean, why is it, for example, that when gas is has come down in price, and the price, some of these have come down to last year's prices, we're still being faced with these extremely high costs, and then this on top of it. I mean, is there any sense that you get, I don't know if you sort of talk to colleagues from across the chamber or not, but is there any sense that you get that perhaps people really, the elected representatives really understand the scale of the suffering? I mean, the scale of the potential for the entire economy collapsing around our ears.
I think some do. I think an awful lot. I think it's passing them by to some extent. That's my impression. Certainly. But there are voices on the Tory benches who are calling calling this out to some extent. Certainly not to the extent that I would want, but it's clear, and it was very clear when Kwasi Kwarteng made his statement, that the faces that he couldn't see behind him on the Tory benches, but I could see sitting opposite, were grim. There were a few people who seemed to think that this was a sensible direction of travel, but there were an awful lot of very concerned looking faces, and there were certainly questions and comments from the Conservative benches, as well as obviously an awful lot from our side of the House of Commons. And I think that it would certainly be extremely helpful if people in positions of authority had a much better understanding of the reality of people's day-to-day lives. I think that if you look at the priorities of the Westminster government at the moment, lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses, making it possible for people who are already very wealthy to become wealthier, it's absolutely miles and miles and miles away from the reality of people's day-to-day lives, most people's day-to-day lives, where folk are really worried. They were already really worried, and now there's a whole other layer of concern on top of that about how they're just going to get from one day to the next. And I do think that that's really remote from a lot of the political classes at Westminster. I think it's yet another reason why an awful lot of folk will look at this chaos and just reflect that we can do so much better than this. There is absolutely no way that Scotland couldn't do much, much better for the people who live here than this absolute shambles. And it is an unforgivable shambles that we're currently facing under the Westminster government. So, an independent Scotland cannot come quickly enough, because we can make much better decisions for the people that live in Scotland. People in Scotland really shouldn't have to be in the midst of this absolute shambolic chaos.
Well, the shambolic chaos is A way to get worse as food prices in the UK have soared by a record 10.6% this month as the war in Ukraine and Brexit continues to drive the cost of staples such as margarine, pasta, and tinned tomatoes to new highs. Overall, shoppers faced 5.7% inflation in September, up from 5.1% in August, the highest monthly rate since the British Retail Consortium Nielsen IQ'd index began in 2005. Inflation in food prices this month has climbed past the 9.3% reported in August, fueled by the weakness in the UK economy, Brexit, and the war in Ukraine, which are pushing up the price of animal feed, fertilizer, and vegetable oil, with a knock on effect on products such as margarine. Fresh food products cost a record 12.1% more than last year, up from 10.5% in August, the highest rate for the category on record. Inflation for some staples, such as pasta and tinned tomatoes, has reached a record 8.6%, up from 7.8% a month previously, the fastest rate of increase for this category. Non food inflation rose from 2.9% in August to 3.3%, driven mostly by bigger hardware, DIY, and gardening products hit by rising transport costs. I mean, Kirsten, these kinds of figures are just unbelievable when you think how many people already are working and they still can't afford to feed themselves, far less aspire to things like, buying a home or giving their kids clothes. It's it's really terrifying for a lot of people. So where where are we supposed to go from here? I mean, apart from, as you say, independence is the answer that many will look to because it's hard to think that the Scottish people would do a worse job of governing ourselves than is happening with this so-called strong and stable Tory government. But what kind of caseload are you getting? What kind of evidence are you seeing that this is really hitting people?
I think that there's two elements to the caseload actually. So one side of it is the real challenges that people are facing in managing. They're really worried about how they're going to get from one day to the next or one week to the next. There's just not enough money coming in to pay for the bare essentials. Never mind anything extra. The bare essentials are a real challenge, and I have a really significant caseload in East Renfrewshire, which I'm grateful for because if people feel able to come and ask for support, then they will absolutely get whatever support I can give. But the other quite significant level of caseload is from businesses, smaller businesses in particular, who are really worried about how they'll sustain. And I think that that is a concern across the board for businesses, whether they be farming businesses or whether they be retail businesses. And I think that that's an area of concern, but the very pressing need of individuals, I think, is something that is a worry for an awful lot of us. Because if you look at these figures that you quoted, the very staple kind of foodstuffs that people are going to need just to feed their families, feed themselves. The rates of inflation for some of these staples are really, really significant. They've gone up in price a huge amount. And of course, at the same time, people have not had that huge amount of an increase in income, and there'll be other very pressing calls on the funds that they have as well. So everything is going up. There's a very limited amount of money available to pay for food, which has got so much more expensive. And all of these pressures are amplified for people who are already not so well off. So the more that you were already struggling, the more that you will be struggling now. It's like, piling challenge upon challenge and difficulty upon difficulty. And, these additional hardships are ones that it's very difficult for people to see a way through. And, whilst the Scottish Government is doing, I think, a really sterling job in mitigating, in supporting, in managing signposting and facilitating different ways of making sure that people are getting as much help as possible, the underlying situation is very severe, and there's no getting away from that. People do not have the funds to put food on the table. We're coming into the colder weather. We've probably all noticed that. I think over the last week or so, suddenly it's felt like it's definitely autumn, and people are cold as well, and they're going to get colder. Folk are really worried about putting the heating on. Nobody's going to be putting the heating on this winter, really, are they? They're going to be putting on as many jumpers and so on as possible. But again, the people who that kind of challenge affect most are the people who have already got other significant challenges. So people who have disabilities, for instance, or people who are maybe a bit older, in families with very young children. That there are groups of people who really need to be able to put that heating on, and they're the ones who are particularly vulnerable in this because they may already not have a great deal of money. The money already may not stretch as far as it needs to. And here they are looking at all these additional costs that are coming on top of what they already knew was a cost of living crisis. So this is going to be a challenging winter, and I am very grateful for the action that the Scottish Government's taking, but we need the Westminster Government to get a grip on things, get themselves back, have the Parliament recalled, and look at rethinking some of their current plans, because they're just not sustainable for people.
Well, alarming news today is that more than 1 million people in the UK have experienced life-threatening asthma attacks after cutting back on medicine because, of course, in England, prescription charges have to be paid for, heating or food amid the soaring cost of living crisis, a survey suggests. 1 in 5, that's 20% of people living with asthma in the UK, of which there are 5.4 million, have had an attack as a result of changes they have been forced to make due to rising energy, food, and household bills, according to research by Asthma and Lung UK. Fuel poverty campaigners described the figures as distressing. Almost half of the 3,600 people with lung conditions such as asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, that's COPD, and bronchiectasis surveyed by the charity said their health had worsened since the crisis began. Asthma and Lung UK warned there could be a tidal wave of hospital admissions on an already stressed NHS, especially in England, in the next few months as cold weather, an abundance of viruses, and people cutting back on medicines, heating, food, and electricity put them at increased risk. The survey found 90% of people with lung conditions had already made significant changes to cope with the rising cost of living, such as 63% eating less and buying less food, 15% cutting back on their inhaler to make it last longer, and 5% borrowing medicines from someone else, and 6% not collecting their prescriptions. So some of these figures obviously are relating to England, where, as I said earlier, you have to pay for essential medications such as your asthma inhaler. There are no charges for medical prescriptions in Scotland. So that mitigates some of the issues facing people. But yesterday, poverty campaigners and age campaigners were saying that they're concerned that people are going to die, and that in England, especially where the NHS is on its knees. I mean, often people in Scotland don't realise just how truly terrible things are in England because the Scottish Government has made so many mitigating um, policies, and which we pay for through our taxes. And quite frankly, I'm very happy to pay a slightly higher rate of tax if that's required of me to make sure that we've got prescriptions and health services that are available to everybody. And thank goodness for that. I mean, just how big an issue do you think this is going to be? You were talking about the heating issue. One of the things that worries me is the fact that for a lot of people, things that we don't tend to talk about are things like having hot water to wash your dishes with, or having hot water to shower with, or especially if you're dealing with people who've got certain disabilities, or young children, or people who've got their period, or people who've got continence issues, or washing your clothes. The increase in children being embarrassed to go to school because their school uniform hasn't been washed properly. I mean, these are all really significant issues that more and more people will face. So I mean, as somebody who represents a community and sort of, is their voice in Westminster, what kind of impact are you seeing from the folk of East Renfrewshire, for example?
I'm really concerned about this. So I know from talking to local organisations who are involved in supporting different groups of people who are perhaps facing financial challenges, that their caseloads, the number of people, the number of families that they're working with, have gone up significantly, and that's all part of this cost of living crisis. And I can't see that going any other way, but rising again and doing that significantly. And I am really worried about folk who are more vulnerable. So as you've said, it's not a straightforward situation where you're just looking at the cost of one element of your life. So we spoke about food, and obviously food costs are absolutely critical, but you may have other needs which are particularly pressing in your household. So, the electricity to run your washing machine, for instance. Have you even got a washing machine? What happens if that's broken? How are you going to get a new washing machine and, pay for that? And, how do you even in some cases pay for the power supply to cook the food that you have? We've all heard, I think, quite distressing cases of people who've been given food provision. So they're already in a really difficult situation. They're having a really challenging time. They're having, to be provided with food by maybe a food bank or a larger or similar. And the food may not be suitable because there's an assumption that they have the wherewithal to cook that. And, that I think is a real worry that, there are people who have got this vulnerability already, whether that's a straightforward, if there's such a thing, financial vulnerability, or whether it's because the household has people with particular needs. So, people with disabilities who may need a warmer house than someone in a different situation may require. And these are essential things. Or people who need, machines which are powered by electricity to actually survive, to sustain themselves. You can't do without that. That is an absolute essential. That's one of the things that is a must have in that household. And my concern, I think, is actually for the community as a whole, because even those who are, usually not struggling, I think are seeing a struggle on the horizon, and are trying very hard to tighten their belts. But people who are already doing that, who have got no more tightening that they can possibly do, these are the people that I think we should be really focusing on. And that's why some of the work of the Scottish Government is really important. You mentioned that people need a washing machine to wash their clothes. It could be an issue, for people who have their period. Well, some of the period poverty work that the Scottish Government's done is taking a small chunk away from the expenditure that they would be looking at. The prescriptions is a huge deal. So I think that we've forgotten, maybe in Scotland sometimes, that this is not something that everybody in the UK benefits from, the free prescriptions that we benefit from. I think that's incredibly important, because that unfortunately is something that people cut down on. People make decisions about what prescriptions they feel they need, where there is a cost attached to these things, and obviously that has a really detrimental impact upon people's health. But if they simply can't afford to pay for that, then they can't afford to pay for it. So these kind of policies, making sure that children are getting fed, making sure that there's a grant there to pay for some elements of school uniform, for instance. There's lots of different things that the Scottish Government is doing that, thankfully we're accustomed to, that are taking some of these challenges away. But I don't think we can make any mistake about the scale of what the UK government has done, in particular with this latest announcement, and the scale of the difficulty that that's going to cause people.
And do you get any sense when you're talking to the people across the aisle from you, that that they that they get it, that they care? I mean, surely some of these red wall Tories that represent quite challenged communities often have to have some sense of the damage that they're doing. How can they look at themselves in the mirror and still vote for these policies?
I mean, I don't know what kind of caseload that different MPs have in different areas. My own experience is that caseloads and the kind of cases that you get, can vary wildly from constituency to constituency, and even from day to day, to be honest. So, I'm sure that people will get a variety of cases in, but what impact that has upon their own thinking, I think, is probably the question. I do think that the red wall Tories, and I'm sure a number of others as well, will be looking, if not with concern, for the people who are affected. And I would hope they would be concerned about the people affected, because there'll be an awful lot of people that are going to be challenged by this. Surely they would be looking at their own situations as well, and just pragmatically thinking, this is a bit of a disaster, because whatever angle you look at it from, it is a bit of a disaster, but the impact on households is going to be really significant. And I do hope that people come to recognise that pretty sharpish, because it does need to be dealt with.
Well, the Scottish Parliament report, a Scottish Parliament report, has recommended that the UK government take action to align benefits and tax credits with inflation and to reinstate the uplift in universal credit to tackle Scotland's health inequalities. The report by Holyrood's Health, Social Care and Sport Committee also recognised that powers over employment law and the majority of work-related social security benefits are reserved to the UK government, and that both the COVID-19 pandemic and the rapidly rising cost of living have exacerbated health inequalities across Scotland. Commenting on the report, committee member and SNP MSP Emma Harper said, "Much of the expert evidence behind this report highlighted how much good work is already being done by the SNP Scottish Government to tackle the root causes of poverty and associated poor health. With its fixed budget and limited borrowing powers, the Scottish Government is doing its best to fight poverty with one hand tied behind its back. But game-changing policies like the £25 per week Scottish Child payment can only do so much when the Tories are setting fire to the economy. What is clear is that the policies of the Tory Westminster government are having negative and long lasting consequences. In reality, they are cancelling out that good work by increasing poverty, which in turn directly impacts on the health of many low income households. Well, across the water, um, more than $8 billion has been pledged by private corporations and non-profit groups to help President Biden achieve his goal to end hunger and cut diet-related diseases, White House officials announced today. Donors include food industry lobby groups, pharmaceutical companies, the world's second largest meat packing company, medical associations, a film studio, as well as philanthropic foundations and universities. The announcement comes as the White House hosts the first conference on hunger, nutrition, and health in 53 years. Since then, food insecurity has improved but remains shockingly high, with 1 in 10 American households struggling to feed their families in 2021, while the consumption of processed unhealthy foods and diet related diseases have risen exponentially. Many of the commitment donations or support to the country's food banks, which are relied upon every month by tens of millions of people who cannot afford to feed their families. A compliance mechanism to ensure donors follow through with their commitments has not yet been created, administration officials noted. Neither the financial nor the national strategy published on Tuesday provide concrete policy commitments to eradicate racial, economic, and rural inequalities, which are among the root causes of food poverty and processed diets that contribute to obesity, diabetes, and high blood pressure. The US food strategy wants to cut these life shortening conditions by increasing access to healthy food and exercise, as new data shows that more than 35% of people in 19 states and 2 territories are obese, more than double the number of states in 2018, while 1 in 10 Americans has diabetes. It's really interesting, Kirsten, to see what's happening with the Biden administration. We'll see what happens with the midterms coming up in next month or in November. But when we hear talk of the food banks and the work that Biden is trying to do, it's stark to think that just 15 years ago, food banks weren't a thing in the UK, and now we seem to be sort of heading down that Americanized road. So it's interesting to see that Biden perhaps is trying to sort of find ways to tackle these American inequalities, and yet the UK is sort of being forced to accept this as a new normality as well. What's your view on the way in which Biden is trying to move things forward, and is there any hope that we one day will stop this Americanized import of food banks?
I think that point that you made is really interesting. That we didn't have food banks, only a short number of years ago. So, how have we come to the situation that these are now seen as almost a normal part of any community? And that's not to take away from the absolutely sterling work that people who help food banks and the people who work there, the volunteers do. They do an absolutely brilliant thing, because they are making sure that they support people in need. That obviously shouldn't be the case. So, I'm certainly attracted to any policy platform that looks at what underlies this? How do we get away from this situation where people are not able to sustainably put food on the table and feed their household? And, if you think about the worries that families are going to have over this winter, I think that that's surely something that people would agree is a priority and should be a priority, because we shouldn't have people who are hungry in Scotland, and we shouldn't have that situation across the UK. You spoke about the child payment. I think that's a really good example, the Scottish child payment, of something that is a bit of a game changer in terms of trying to alleviate some of these cost pressures, make it possible for folk to manage, where really that was a struggle because of the difference between what's coming in and what needs to go out. And I think if you sort of look at the situation where Biden is trying to find ways to get through this and to drive a different course, and maybe contrast that with the UK government, where they could follow the Scottish government's road. They could put a child payment into place. They could follow the road that we're suggesting, and look again at their refusal to go back on the uplift to universal credit. They could do all kinds of different things that would put a little bit more money into the pockets that money is really needed in, and that would absolutely help people to find ways to sustain, in a much more regular and much less stressful way for the people in the households who really need that bit of support. But that's not how the UK government is choosing to do things. So they are making different decisions, and these, I think that the words that we heard from the Chancellor last Friday, when he spoke about the way that he would be dealing with people who were claiming benefits, I thought was really quite concerning. That there seemed to be a suggestion somehow that people were maybe not trying hard enough, and I have to say that's not my experience of the people who live in East Renfrewshire. People are absolutely trying their very best to get by. People are not sitting around and waiting for something to land on their lap. It's quite the opposite of that, and I think that kind of narrative is damaging, and it also means that people in positions of power have closed their mind to the fact that the reality is that people are trying their very best to get by, but that the system is not working properly for them. And again, it takes me back to that very clear need for us to have a way to make a different future with a different kind of system, so that people do have the ability to thrive, and that we have communities where these are not the pressing worries. But I think in terms of the here and now, we need to keep the pressure up on the UK government. It's ridiculous, for instance, that we haven't got the power over employment in Scotland. So we would have the potential to do a lot, and very constructively so, if we had these powers. But we don't have these powers, and we've been promised an employment bill in Westminster for, I cannot actually remember how long. It's been apparently coming for a number of years. It's not come. I very much doubt that it's coming. I don't think that there's the remotest intention from the UK government to improve people's situations in terms of their work. We heard what they said about people who are members of trade unions last Friday as well. So I think that the direction of travel in terms of fair work is really troubling. The characterisation of people who have views that don't chime with the Tory Westminster government is really foolish, I think, and really ill considered. But it all comes back to this one, I think, overriding concern that they don't really get it. They don't know what the reality of people's lives really are like, and they don't understand that people are very, very often trying very hard to get by, but it just doesn't add up. That's what we need to tackle, and that's why we need the powers to actually do that.
It's interesting, isn't it, that there's this narrative about people need to find better paid jobs. And I mean, just last year, 2 years ago, we were clapping for the cleaners who were actually risking their lives on a daily basis to go in and make places COVID safe. I mean, I don't. It's really weird to think that there's a whole area of Westminster politicians who actually probably rely quite a lot on domestic staff in their own sphere and around Westminster, and and somehow those people and those jobs aren't valued. And what I sometimes wonder is, how do people in England view Scotland? Because the Scottish government is sort of, doing a remarkably good job with one hand tied behind its back on bringing in this Scottish child payment, which has been described as a game changer by child poverty charities, and prescription charges being abolished, university education. The Scottish government, with remarkably few levers, is doing a significant amount to make life better for the people of Scotland. Surely people in England must sort of look and go, well, how come they can do it and we can't? Or do people, are they so unaware of what Scottish news is that they just don't get it?
I'm not sure that it is broadly or widely covered in a way that would make most people familiar with the things that might be different, so, whether that be, the Scottish Child Payment and the difference that that can make, that's something that I think people are not broadly aware of, or, whether you're looking back at these free prescriptions we talked about, free university tuition. These are, really important things for people in Scotland because they make our lives easier. People have come to absolutely rely upon them, and quite correctly so, because these are tools that the Scottish government has put in place to make it possible for people to be healthier, to receive an education, to look after the needs of their family, the better. But I'm not sure that that's something that always gets the cut through across the UK. I do think that these are policies that people would find very interesting, and want to hear more about, and perhaps question why they're not the policies that the Conservative government in Westminster is choosing to put into place, if perhaps there was a broader conversation about these things, because it does all come down to choices at the end of the day. What political choices is your government making? So the Tory government at Westminster is making political choices to make sure that there isn't a cap on bankers' bonuses, to make sure that the tax arrangements for people who are already very wealthy are even more advantageous to them, so that they are all the more wealthy. And at the same time, they're talking about making people who are already struggling um, live a more challenging life and struggle even further financially. And you can contrast that with the approach of the Scottish government, where there is this appreciation that things like the Scottish Child Payment can make a significant difference. The uprating of benefits, which was not something which was done in the Westminster Parliament, can make a significant difference to people. People who are looking at their children going through school and thinking, maybe my child will go to university. That's something that isn't off the table for families, where it would otherwise be impossible because of the costs involved. And that, in terms of the future of Scotland, and us looking forward, I think is really important too. And when we look at independence, and the way that Scotland will be in the future, how we will grow this sustainable, fairer society, that I think that we're so needing at the moment, that these things are going to be really crucial. Having an educated population who are engaged in how to make the lives of all of the community better, that's certainly something that I think would be of interest to people, certainly beyond Scotland too.
Yeah, and recent research has pointed out that the Scottish population are the best educated in the UK, and rank very highly across the developed world. A new website providing information on the wide range of advice and financial support available to people in Scotland has been launched. Developed by the Scottish Government as a one-stop shop to help those struggling with the cost of living crisis, the website includes information on help available for households to meet rising energy, housing, and other costs. It also provides details of accessing Scottish and UK social security payments, including online benefit calculators, as well as wider health and well-being information. A programme for government 22 to 23 commitment, it will be supported by a nationwide media campaign to raise awareness of the website and signpost people impacted by rising costs to the help available. The website was launched by Social Justice Secretary Shona Robeson during a visit to Debt Help Service in Tollcross, Edinburgh, run by the charity Christians Against Poverty. Shona Robertson said, I know people are struggling with the cost of living crisis right now and may not know where to turn for help. Our cost of living website is a trustworthy online resource with information on the wide range of vital support available. The cost of living crisis is impacting every household in the UK, and the Scottish Government will continue to do everything within its powers and finite budget to ensure people are supported as far as possible. Kirsten, I was seeing yesterday that there's talk that the devolved governments may well come under significant pressure because so many of the financial impacts, because England is marked, sort of as England for the population of England and their budgets are sort of held as the sort of the anchor by which all these other budgets are measured. Um, what pressures do you think the Scottish Government is going to come up against, and how well, with its new social security powers and websites like this, how well do you think it is placed to mitigate the sort of the worst cruelties of the Conservative government's policies in Westminster?
This current situation will absolutely cause budgetary strain for the Scottish Government, for all devolved governments. And, that in itself is deeply, deeply depressing, and it's a reality nonetheless that the Scottish Government are going to have to deal with. And that has an impact on everybody and everybody's day-to-day lives because of these choices that the Westminster Government have made and the really bullheaded approach to dealing with the choices that they've made. I think the other side of your question, though, if you think about the information that is on that website, I think that is actually really helpful because people do worry about where to turn. Naturally, they worry about where to turn. People are not experts in all of the different sources of advice and information and help that may be available to them. How could they be? How would they know? And I think that the Scottish Government is doing a really helpful job here. I think that this is a really worthwhile endeavour. I think that it's something that people will come to find very useful, and it'll be a really helpful signpost for people. It doesn't obviously take away from the challenges themselves, but to know where you might go for further advice or support or help, I think is really important. And the Scottish Government did a very good job of that during the COVID crisis, and I imagine that a similar approach will be taken here to making sure that that information is easy to digest, easy to read, easy to deal with, and to move forward with. And that, I think, is the same approach that the Scottish Government has taken in terms of social security, and that could not be in starker contrast to the way that the UK government deals with benefits. So that person-centred approach, the way that the system itself works, the way that users are central to looking at how best the system should work and how it does work, that the Scottish Government has put into place, as well as these additional benefits that are coming to people in Scotland because of the way that the system is being worked here. I do think it's night and day compared to the way that the DWP work, and certainly the comments from the Chancellor, I think, mean that this is going to be an even starker contrast, and I find that deeply depressing, but I'm very grateful for the way that the social security operation in Scotland is being run. I think that it is already making a significant difference to people's experiences of the system, and I think that the structure means that difference will continue to be felt, and that is really important. People should be able to go about their lives with dignity, and really that's what underlies that.
Well, people who are trying to go about their lives with dignity in Ukraine are being supported by the Scottish Government. A charity that is working in Ukraine to remove debris left behind by the ongoing invasion by Russia has received £300,000 of Scottish Government funding. The Halo Trust, which is headquartered in Dumfries and Galloway, has more than 10,000 deminers worldwide and is now utilising some of that expertise in war-torn Ukraine, using the funds committed in the programme for government 2022 to 23. Speaking during a visit to the Halo Trust, where I watched a demonstration of how specially trained staff detect and clear mines, Minister with Special Responsibility for Refugees from Ukraine, Neil Gray, said, when the acting Ukrainian Consul General told the Scottish Government that clearing mines and unexploded ordnance was a priority for his government, we knew we needed to help. As well as saving lives, The work to be carried out by the Halo Trust will improve food security in Ukraine by enabling farmers to safely farm their land again. Well, that's it for this evening. I might go to my guest, Oswald MP. Thank you very much for joining us. Before
Thank
I
you.
go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. So even if you can't afford the £5 a month, get that subscription in, please. Good night, and thank you for watching. I'm Ruth Watson.